Hello, everyone. This is Ray Sammy from Jennifer Schaus & Associates. Welcome to the 2018 edition of Webinar Wednesdays, brought to you live from Washington, D.C., and hosted by Jennifer Schaus & Associates. Our topics cover all things related to U.S. federal government contracts. Thanks for joining us today. Our panelists are industry experts, including consultants, attorneys, accountants, and other professionals who work in the federal contracting sector. Our webinars are complimentary and are held every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern. They're all recorded and can be viewed on our YouTube channel or directly on our website under the webinar tab. In the interest of time, we will not be taking questions, so please send your questions directly to the speaker. His information will be available upon the last slide. All right, a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C.-based consulting firm serving both product and service companies worldwide. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and contract administration. We can help you with GSA schedules, proposal writing, 8A certification, and more. We host events throughout the year, including training classes, so please visit our website or sign up for our complimentary newsletter in order to stay current. Today, we are fortunate enough to be joined by Carl Walenskas of FedTrax. Carl will be discussing 5 signs the RFP is wired and what you can do about it. You can see some of Carl's background on this page. Thanks for joining us today, Carl. Let's dig into 5 signs the RFP is wired and what to do about it.
Thank you, Sammy. Appreciate you having me. Thanks to Jennifer for putting this on. This is the second or third one of these that I've done. Well, I can tell you one thing right away, that this topic must resonate with you people, because it seems like we've got a couple of hundred people signed up for this webinar, which is wonderful. And I've also put out something similar in my LinkedIn feed in the past, and it's generated thousands of views. So apparently there are a lot of frustrated contractors who can at the very least empathize with this, if not completely relate to it. And of course, everybody has their own ways that they can tell that the RFP is wired. And we're going to get into that. We call that a little bit of a gate process that I would like you to use. But first, let me start off with sort of the basics. The difference between business and development and what we call bluebirds, if you've heard that term before, that's basically a long shot. So, you know, with the business development, you've got relationships inside an agency. You've got people who know you and love you, or at least listen to you, and you can have conversations about what might be coming and ways to sort of develop business as you go through that capture process. And there's generally a longer development cycle. You're really focused in on what your competitive advantage is. What do you bring to the table that the rest of the people don't? Because if you do that, you can get an inside track, and perhaps that competitive advantage that you have, if it's a real competitive advantage, that's a whole nother webinar. What you can bring to the sort of the RFP that they must eventually send out, that sort of sends it in your direction. You have a better than average chance of winning it. And you've got past performance in an agency. What we call a long shot or a bluebird is you don't necessarily have a relationship. You're cruising FBO, and on the FedBizOps website, you see things that it's posted and you can do. You've got the technical capacity, you have the technical capability to be able to do this, and you start salivating like Pavlov's dogs because you say, wow, this thing's a 1+4 deal, and it's going to result in $10 million in business for us, and we can do this. Okay, be careful. You may have the talent, you may have the time, and you most certainly have the need, but that's what this webinar is about. Oftentimes, and I put down this bullet, it happens in summertime. This happens right as the summer proposal season's heating up and the federal government is starting to post a lot of things publicly to try and commit money before the end of September. And I talk to a lot of clients and prospects out there who, when you talk to them in that July, August timeframe, they tell me their heads are down, and because they're working on all these proposals. Unfortunately, most of them you can't win, but let's move on. Next. So what exactly is a wired request for proposal? First of all, it means that the fix is in and that you really don't have a shot at this. It's not legal. The federal government will tell you that this doesn't occur, and nor should it, for publicly available opportunities. It shouldn't happen, but it does. These tend to be oftentimes on recompetes, and contracting officers might use this for vetting new contractors, seeing what kind of response they get. They may use an RFP to see if they can take something that was for large businesses and find small businesses who may be qualified to do that in order to meet some of the agency mandates for use of small businesses. And many times they're using it to drive the incumbent price down on the recompete. If you've ever been an incumbent on a contract, you know that the dream of raising your prices for inflationary purposes generally just is that. It's a dream. And the other reason is they'll fulfill federal acquisition regulation mandates, FAR and DFAR mandates. When they do this, they'll put proposals out there that they really don't have an idea that they're going to find somebody new and replace that. And these, I'll give you 5 reasons here. That's what this webinar is about. Of why you can't win, how to recognize them, and then maybe different things that you can do instead. Next. So the first thing is, you look at the wolf there on your screen, is hyper-aggressive due dates. I call that the sort of the rule of 10. Okay, it requires a technical approach, and it's more than butts and seats. So it's not like they're just asking for certain resumes and you need people to do this, which you could turn around pretty quickly and respond to. But it's asking for a hardcore technical plan. How are you going to skin this cat? How are you going to solve this problem? And you've got less than 10 days to respond to that. That is usually an indicator that this thing might be geared or wired for somebody else. One of the first tactics that I take on these, if you smell this coming and you think that this could just be an oversight, request a 2-week extension. If they give that to you, perhaps this reason is not a reason to believe that this is a wired opportunity. If they come back and they take a firm position and they say we're not going to provide an extension for this, and they're looking for a very detailed technical response to people who at this point have never seen this before, watch out. That should send off alarm bells. And the same thing happens if they come back and say, well, we'll extend it a couple of days. You will have a feel if this is sufficient time to respond to this or not, given the fact that you're also running a business. Next. So the next thing is unrealistic requests. If they're asking for the pink unicorn during the proposal stage, again, hyper specific, but just have a natural feel for what your level of response is versus the potential award in this. So if the proposal, if you've got a shorter period of time and you combine that with a proposal that's 50 pages or something like that, boy, that starts to sound like an unrealistic request. If they're looking for presentations in a multi-phased approach for a relatively small award, that starts to sound like something that the federal government generally doesn't get involved with. One thing that is really an indicator, a red flag that this could be a wired opportunity, pre-award functional prototypes. I'll give you an example. There was something that we were doing for content management a couple of years ago, and I was going in with a partner, and they asked for a very complicated DevOps in a development laboratory environment pre-award prototype. This was only a 1+2 option, and they wanted the entire they had a whole network architecture and things all fleshed out. That gave us an immediate clue that somebody else has already got the inside track on this one, and you're going to be going through not only the effort of generating a proposal, but engaging your technical team to start developing things that you really don't have much of a chance of winning. Next. What about vague wording? Now, this almost seems like it flies in the face of what I just said, which is really overly specific, hyper aggressive requests or very specific requests. Seems like the opposite, but what I mean is you have to determine, are you dealing with a junior contract officer who just hasn't written the RFP or the statement of work correctly? And you can tell things like this when you'll see duplicated sections in the RFP and things like that where they have the exact same content in 2 different sections. Generally, that's not the case. But if they'll have some very general requirements for what you know to be a very maybe technically complex response, that should give you pause. there's usually a Q&A period for all RFPs. Look at the answers to those. When you submit the questions, the amount of time they take to return responses on these questions is a whole nother issue. But let's just assume they do that in a reasonable amount of time. How clear are the questions being answered? Are you getting a little bit of the stiff arm from the contracting officer or whoever is doing the response to the questions, like continually directing your question back to the RFP as if this is a stupid question? That means that they don't want to answer that question, and it should be an indicator that something is a problem. So what people tend to do to respond to these is they put in qualifiers. We call these subject twos in their response. If this occurs, we're making this assumption and this assumption. My rule of thumb is this: if you have more than 3 assumptions that you're making in order to justify your response, chances are you might want to reconsider that. That's too many things that you have to sort of dispute or put in qualification clauses to your response to an RFP. So it's just another data point to take. How people generally get around this is if they don't, let's think about this for a minute. They'll add fat in the terms of cost to their price proposal. They'll add extra what if. What if they mean this? What if they mean that? Well, you've pretty much just guaranteed yourself a chance that you're not going to win that proposal, because even if it's listed as best value, all things being equal, turns into almost like an LPTA, lowest price technically acceptable proposal, pretty quickly. So price is important, even if it's not the predominant thing, as is supposedly the case in a best value response. So you got to be careful about just adding fat in a federal response. And if you go in too aggressive, then you set yourself up for missed expectations and a nightmare in managing this thing once you get going, and potential disputes during the course of delivery on the project. And that's worse than walking away from a proposal. Trust me. There could be one exception where there's some vague warning, is when they're actually looking for innovation. This is when the person who's posting the RFP is looking for differences in responses and wants to see the differences in technical approaches to a complex problem. They may leave it open. If that's the type of thing, this might not necessarily be a deal killer when the wording is vague, if you know what I mean. Next. Here's another one to watch out for: overly specific past performance requests. If they're looking for a needle in a haystack, you've got experience with this agency A, in Division B, and you've got System C past performance and qualification specs. That's really, really narrowing the field down of people who will have all of those. If that's the case, and they seem to be very strict with regard to your past performance and how overly specific they are, that's a warning sign that somebody else has those, because there might only be 1 or 2 companies or organizations in the world who can respond to those specific requests. A sanity check would be if it's more than one respondent or more than one incumbent, could you reasonably compete with this? And if you can't reasonably compete because of your lack of past performance, which is weighed very heavily in government responses, there's a good chance that you notch that in your data points as potentially something to walk away from. Next. The 5th reason is exacting personnel requirements. This is just an allegory to what we talked about, past performance requests. If they're looking for the Nobel Prize laureate in a certain system, or again, very specific personnel requirements in terms of certifications, your education requests, if they're looking for people that just typically aren't usually available for something, unless it is some PhD level innovation request, and then usually they're just more concerned about the solution than the personnel demands. This is a sign that perhaps they're reading the personnel requirements directly from the incumbent who's on the contract. And for ease, sometimes contracting officers or people who post RFPs for the government will do this. A lot of times this means similar to contract and program requirements for past performance. This could be specific system requirements, not publicly available or COTS products, but systems inside the government, like the Air Force XYZ program, DCGS system, satellite X, Y, or Z. Those things generally tend to box out other folks and really narrow down who can respond to this. Next. So now what do you do about it? I mean, those are 5 things. You can probably all relate to one or more of those types of requirements. What exactly can you do to avoid that? Because the downside of this is if you've got nothing better to do with your time, oftentimes in the summertime when BD events and things like that are down, people will tend to chase some bluebirds. But you still end up spending an exorbitant amount of time responding to these things. And that time equals money in terms of your resources and resource demands. I use a stage gate evaluation process for RFPs, which means of these 5 things, if one of them occurs, I mean, and one could be enough to be a deal breaker, but if one of those occurs, your caution level is up. But if you're very dubious if 2 of these 5 reasons occur. And if 3 times, just run for the hills. You don't want to respond to this because if any 3 of these things occur, it is a wire to RFP and you're just absolutely wasting your time. You're not going to ingratiate yourself with the agency and penetrate that new agency as you might be doing for strategic purposes. Better to focus on your business development opportunities before public RFPs. And you know this, everybody knows this, but oftentimes, again, late in the summer, people forget about this. Focus on planting the seeds on your existing contracts. Focus on taking your meetings with the people inside agencies who can help you, dealing with the contractors in advance who have line items available for potential task order increases to their contracts. If you're a small business partnering with a large, plant the seed about how you can make that program better, how you make that program officer's life a little bit better. Do those capture activities in advance, and you might have the opportunity to direct that request for information towards something that you do when it eventually comes out. It'll be something that gives you the competitive advantage and perhaps the funding as well. And that's the ultimate goal for all of us, isn't it? We want to wire the RFP in our favor legally and above board, but that's what we want to do, and that's what good business development does. It's a better place to spend your time. That's all I've got for you for the purposes of this webinar. And Sammy, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Wow, great presentation information, Carl. Thanks so much for sharing your time and knowledge on this topic. And thanks especially to our attendees. If you have questions, please contact Carl directly with the information you see on the screen in front of you. Next week, we're going to be covering understanding set-asides. The full schedule of webinars can be found on our website under the webinar tab. Thank you, and this concludes this webinar.